Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I have not seen a performance like that from a Prime Minister, lacking in any empathy for the struggles that Australians are feeling under his watch, and indeed refusing to accept the words that he said before the election. Now, there is one number that will not come out of this Prime Minister's mouth, and it certainly hasn't left his mouth since the election, and that's the number 275. But it was a number that was used a lot before the election by this Prime Minister in a succession of broken promises that we see from the Prime Minister. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's an interesting political tactic, the Prime Minister just stonewalling time after time on promises and words that are in transcripts, that are recorded on televisions, on devices, but completely refusing to acknowledge words that he used before the election. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, we're seeing a growing list of broken promises. Indeed, we saw yesterday from the Leader of the Opposition the top 10, the top 10 shameful promises that have not been met by this government. We've seen, of course, their promise to bring power bills down by $275. We even had members of the front bench confirm in interjections across the dispatch box, yes, we did promise to reduce power prices by $275, but by 2025. Well, I hate to break it to the government, but every single year of price rises of over $1,000, that task gets even harder. Does anybody seriously believe that the Prime Minister will be able to deliver $275 power and energy price reductions by 2025? They promised cheaper mortgages.
They did.
Now, every time we ask the Prime Minister if he stands by his position on cheaper mortgages, he disingenuously says, oh, well, I didn't want to mislead the Australian people about cheaper mortgages. I was talking about our shared equity plan. There's only one problem. Their shared equity plan does not exist. It was supposed to start on the 1st of January. Now, that's at least 2 months ago, and we have not seen this so-called shared equity plan, a very token policy, to date. We saw that they promised cost of living relief. Indeed, all of us will remember the drop to the papers with the Prime Minister with a supercilious smile on the front, promising these cost of living reductions. Does anybody seriously think that the Labor Party ever thought they could deliver on those promises? Does anyone seriously think that the Prime Minister thought he could deliver on these promises? And what we see now, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a Prime Minister who wants to entirely divorce himself from speaking about the economy. Now, it should be no surprise to the Australians watching on television, Australians throughout our country, indeed the Australians visiting our parliament today, that a Prime Minister who on day one of the election campaign did not know the cash rate, did not know the unemployment rate, that someone that didn't know those two things is someone now who sits in a very important chair in this chamber and who does not want to speak about the economy, indeed has no understanding or interest in economic matters. Well, the message to the Prime Minister and to his party is Australians are very concerned. Australians are concerned with the pressures that they're facing. We saw today at 2:30 an announcement that the Reserve Bank has increased interest rates again by 0.25%. I'm not sure how that fits into the strategy and the promise around cheaper mortgages from this Prime Minister, but I've never seen less empathy come from a leader in this parliament.
Yeah, it doesn't care.
And I'm not just confecting it. I have not seen a Prime Minister who refuses to empathise with the millions of Australians now who every single month, when they get the letter or the email from the bank saying your mortgage has gone up, that they then have to make very binary decisions. And those decisions are, do I send my child on a school camp? What do I buy from the supermarket? Do I fill up the car or do I just not drive? I mean, these are the binary decisions that are being made by Australians, and yet we've got a Prime Minister that stands there refusing to even acknowledge that he made those promises. He refuses to acknowledge that those words came out of his mouth. That is an extraordinary insult to the Australian people. My advice for the Prime Minister is apologise. Australians are very understanding people.
First step.
Provided you can prove that you didn't always know that you couldn't make that promise, and to be frank, I think there are a couple of promises here that fall into that category, but the least he should do is apologise, level with the Australian people. Say, I'm sorry, I cannot deliver that commitment of reducing power prices by $275. I'm sorry, Labor's inflationary budget and spending has now meant that we can't deliver cheaper mortgages. I'm sorry that we can't deliver cost of living relief as we promised before the election. But they're making it up as they go, and the Australian people are the ones who pay the price. We also see, throughout question time, a cavalcade of questions around their big borrowing and big spending funds. How many questions have we seen over the last few weeks in relation to their $15 billion reconstruction fund, their $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund? Let me just turn to the Housing Australia Future Fund as the Shadow Minister for Housing as an example. It will add to borrowing of $10 billion a year. Now, if there's one message that the Reserve Bank has given the government is stop spending. Why? Because every single $1 billion that the government puts into the economy is $1 billion that the Reserve Bank has to try and take out in higher interest rates. And so when we hear question after question lauding the $25 billion of additional borrowing, all we are hearing from the Labor Party is that they are dedicated to pouring fuel on the inflation fire. That's why what we are suffering in Australia, yes, there are global inflationary impacts, but we are facing predominantly Labor inflation. That's what we are seeing. We've also seen from the government that the Labor Party, obviously ensuring they don't bite the hand that feeds them, are unleashing the unions onto small businesses throughout this country. Absolutely unleashing businesses and creating less of a competitive environment for our small businesses. What on earth does the government think that's going to do for inflation? Making it more difficult for small businesses to employ people, making it more difficult for small businesses who have unique circumstances, who now have to deal with the prospect of patent bargaining. All of that is going to make the job much more difficult for the Reserve Bank and will force them, thanks to the Labor Party, to continue jacking up rates. Now, we know the Prime Minister doesn't face these issues. The Prime Minister talks about in his latest broken promise on superannuation, decrying those individuals who have worked hard, have abided by the law and have followed the rules and provided for their retirement. Well, the Prime Minister's defined benefit superannuation, conservatively valued at anywhere from $5 to $10 million, I think highly shows that he is entirely devoid of understanding the pressures that those people face. Now, the Prime Minister and Treasurer studiously avoided dealing with defined benefit superannuation in their announcement, their broken promise. Again, the Prime Minister saying, well, the Prime Minister saying it's not really a broken promise because it only affects 0.5% of people. So if it only affects a small number of people, even though I said I would not touch superannuation before the election, it actually isn't a real promise. It's not a real promise because it's 0.5% of people, and it's those nasty people who've made a bit of money. And then we find out yesterday, by happenstance, in the Senate, that it's actually 10% of people. And who's it going to hit the most? It's going to hit people in their 20s and 30s. They're the people who are going to be hit. The Treasurer joked, oh, well, that's 30 years away. What does the genius think superannuation is? It's about investments for decades into the future. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, we see a succession of broken promises. We don't see this Prime Minister apologising. We see no empathy, and sadly it's the Australian people who are suffering under a Labor government who always get the big economic calls wrong.
Minister.